The paper shook in Ira Alden's hands, not because of the wind cutting down from the Rockies, though it was sharp enough to sting, not because of the dust swirling up from the dry Colorado earth in great amber clouds. The paper shook because the words on it were a betrayal so complete, so calculated, that for a moment Ira forgot how to breathe. He stood in the open doorway of his ranch house, the woman still perched on the wagon seat 10 feet away, watching him with dark eyes that held neither apology nor triumph, just watchfulness, the kind a person develops when they have been let down too many times to expect anything else. The legal notice was dated 3 weeks prior, stamped with the seal of the Territorial Court of Colorado, 1884. It declared, in the cold language of men who had never worked a piece of land with their bare hands, that the eastern parcel of the Alden Ranch, some 240 acres of the finest grazing land in the San Luis Valley, was to revert to its original deed holder. And the original deed holder, according to a document that Ira had never seen and never known existed, was one Thomas Maddox of Pueblo, Colorado. Thomas Maddox, who had been dead for 6 weeks. Thomas Maddox, whose daughter now sat on a borrowed wagon in Ira Alden's yard, holding the reins of a mule that looked as exhausted as she did, wearing a coat that was 2 sizes too large and boots that were crusted with 40 miles of road. Ira looked up from the paper. He looked at her face. He looked at the way she sat very straight despite the obvious weight of whatever she was carrying, and something in his chest moved in a way he did not have a name for. It was not anger, though the anger was there too, hot and electric at the edges. It was something older, something that recognized suffering the way one lamp recognizes another. He said, "You had better come inside." She blinked. It was clear she had not expected that. Neither had he. 6 weeks earlier, Ira Alden had been the kind of man who was certain of everything about his life. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the quiet self-possession of a man who had built something real from almost nothing. His father, Gerald Alden, had come to Colorado in 1861 with $40 and a mule not unlike the one the woman had borrowed, and had scratched the beginnings of a ranch out of land that most men considered impossible. Gerald had died in 1878, leaving a modest operation and a mountain of debt that Ira, at 25, had taken on without complaint. 6 years of work, brutal and unrelenting work, had turned that modest operation into something remarkable. The Alden Ranch now ran nearly 300 head of cattle across 800 acres of valley land, with a bunkhouse that slept 8, a barn that smelled of good hay and healthy animals, and a main house that was nothing fancy but solid in the way that mattered in Colorado winters. Ira had paid every cent of his father's debt and saved enough to feel, for the first time in his adult life, something close to secure. And then the letter had come from the Territorial Court. He had read it 4 times, certain there was an error. The eastern parcel, 240 acres that ran along the creek and contained the best winter grass on the property, could not possibly be the subject of a competing deed. His father had purchased that land in 1865 from a man named Harlan Briggs. The deed was in Ira's strongbox. He had looked at it the morning the court letter arrived, just to reassure himself. The deed was there. Gerald Alden's name was on it. The purchase price, $80, was recorded. Everything was in order. But then a week after the court letter, his lawyer in Alamosa, a careful man named Purcell, had sent a letter of his own. The news in it was the kind that turned a man's mourning to ash. Thomas Maddox, it turned out, had purchased the same eastern parcel in 1863, 2 years before Gerald Alden had bought it from Harlan Briggs. The original land records showed Maddox's deed clearly. Harlan Briggs, who had sold to Gerald Alden, had never actually owned the land free and clear at the time of sale. He had sold something that was not entirely his to sell, which made Gerald Alden's 1865 purchase legally compromised. which meant that the Alden Ranch's claim to the eastern parcel was built on a foundation of hidden deception that had been buried for nearly 20 years. Thomas Maddox had apparently known about this for years and had chosen not to act on it, for reasons that Purcell could not determine. But Thomas Maddox was now dead, and the legal notice had been filed by his estate before his death, and the court had validated it. The eastern parcel would revert to the Maddox estate unless the dispute was resolved otherwise. Purcell's letter ended with a suggestion. If there were any surviving heirs to the Maddox estate, a direct negotiation with them might be more fruitful than a prolonged court battle that Ira was unlikely to win. Ira had filed that letter in the back of his mind and gone on working, because that was what he did. He worked. He did not dwell on problems he could not yet solve. And then on a Tuesday morning in the second week of October, a borrowed wagon had come up his road, and the surviving heir had arrived to do the negotiating herself. The woman climbed down from the wagon without waiting for assistance, which told Ira something about her immediately. She tied the mule to the post near the water trough, gave the animal a brief, tired pat on the neck, and walked toward the porch with the legal notice already in her hand, held out before her like a flag or a shield. She was perhaps 26 or 27, medium height, with brown hair pinned back in a way that was trying to be neat despite the road's best efforts to undo it. Her face was angular and serious, the kind of face that looked like it knew things. "I'm Matilda Maddox," she had said, standing at the bottom of his porch steps. "Thomas Maddox was my father. I believe you've received correspondence from the court regarding the eastern parcel of this property." Ira had taken the legal notice from her hand without a word, read it, and then stood there while the paper shook. Now he stepped back from the doorway and held the door open wider. "Come inside," he said again. "There's coffee on. Whatever this is, it doesn't need to be solved in the cold." Matilda Maddox studied him for a moment longer, then came up the porch steps and walked past him into the house. The interior of the Alden Ranch house was nothing like what Matilda had expected, though she would have struggled to say exactly what she had expected. Something harder, perhaps, more austere. The men who sent legal notices and had lawyers and owned 800 acres were supposed to live in spaces that reflected their power, cold and ordered and indifferent. Instead, the main room was warm from a cast iron stove that radiated heat in generous waves. There were books on a shelf near the window, real books, not for show, because several of them were splayed open or bookmarked with strips of paper. A large map of the San Luis Valley was pinned to the wall above the fireplace, marked with pencil lines that traced the ranch's boundaries. A pair of work gloves had been tossed on the table and not yet put away. The whole room had the feeling of a place where someone actually lived, which was somehow both comforting and unsettling. Ira Alden poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if she wanted one. He set them on the table and pulled out a chair with a nod that said she could sit if she chose to. She chose to. He sat across from her, folded his hands around his cup, and looked at her with gray eyes that were utterly direct. Not unkind, but direct in the way of a man who had decided that pretending was a waste of time. "How did you get here?" he asked, not accusatorially. He seemed genuinely curious. "Wagon," she said. "That's not your wagon." "No," she agreed. "It belongs to a woman named Mrs. Hargrove in Alamosa. She lent it to me in exchange for 3 weeks of mending. The mule is hers too." Ira absorbed this. "You came 40 miles in a borrowed wagon to serve me a legal notice in person." "The court could have done it by letter," Matilda said. "They already had." "I came because I wanted to talk to you directly, and because I was afraid that if I only wrote a letter you might think of me as an abstraction, a legal inconvenience, something to be defeated. And you're not. I'm a woman who spent 6 weeks burying her father and then discovered that he'd left her nothing except a deed to land she'd never seen, a legal claim she doesn't understand completely, and a letter of instruction telling her to come to Colorado and sort it out." She picked up the coffee cup and drank from it. It was strong and good. I'm not an abstraction, Mr. Alden. I'm someone who is trying very hard to figure out what to do next. The room was quiet except for the sound of the wind against the windows and the occasional pop of the stove. Ira said, "Where were you before Colorado?" "Kansas City. My father and I lived there after my mother died. He came west periodically, worked land surveys, investment in claims. I didn't know about the eastern parcel until after he was gone. I found the deed in his papers along with the letter of instruction." "What did the letter say?" Matilda set down the cup. This was the part she had rehearsed, but hearing herself say it aloud to a stranger was different from the silent rehearsals in Mrs. Hargrove's spare room. "He said the land was mine and I should protect it. He said he had been watching the Alden ranch build up around his claim for years and had chosen not to enforce it because he didn't think it was right to take something from a man who had earned it in good faith." She paused. "He said Gerald Alden was a decent man and he didn't want to ruin him." Something shifted in Ira's expression. "But he filed the notice before he died." "Yes," Matilda said. "His doctors told him he had very little time and he panicked, I think. He didn't want the claim to expire or to be lost by default. He said in the letter that he had meant to negotiate something fair, but he ran out of time to do it properly." She looked at her hands. "He asked me to come and negotiate something fair in his place." Ira was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's not the story I expected." "What story did you expect?" "I expected someone to come here and tell me to vacate 240 acres of my best land, backed by a court order and a lawyer who enjoys his work too much." "I don't have a lawyer," Matilda said. "I could barely afford the Wagon." Another silence. This one had a different quality. Less tension, more something that Matilda could not immediately name. Ira Alden got up and went to the window. He stood with his back to her, looking out at the yard where the mule was drinking from the water trough with evident relief. He was a large man, solidly built, and the way he stood, not tense but fully present, suggested a person who had learned to occupy space honestly. She watched the set of his shoulders and tried to read what was happening behind them. "That mule looks like it's done," he said finally. "I know. I'm sorry about that. I pushed harder today than I should have because I wanted to arrive before dark." "It's not a criticism." He turned back to face her. "I have a stall and feed. The animal can rest before you head back." Matilda blinked. "I wasn't expecting to stay." "Where were you expecting to go?" She had not in truth thought that far ahead. She had been so focused on the arrival, on getting through the conversation, that what came after had been somewhat abstract. "I thought perhaps the town. I passed through a place called Garnet about 8 miles back." "Garnet has one boarding house and it charges $2 a night," Ira said. "Which I suspect is about $2 more than you've budgeted." He said it without cruelty, just observation. "The land dispute is going to require more than one conversation. You might as well stay here and talk it through properly. There's a spare room. My housekeeper, Mrs. Castillo, comes 3 days a week, and she was here this morning, so it's decent." Matilda stared at him. "You're inviting a woman who came to take your land to sleep in your house." "I'm inviting a woman who came to negotiate fairly, to do that negotiating from a place that isn't 8 miles away in a boarding house she can't afford." He picked up his coffee cup again. "I also want to hear more about your father, about what he actually knew and when. Because there's a piece of this story I haven't found yet, and you might have it without realizing." That last thing he said caught her in a way she hadn't expected. He was right that there were pieces she didn't fully understand. The hidden history of the land, the transaction between Harlan Briggs and Gerald Alden, the question of why Thomas Maddox had waited so long, all of it was tangled in a way that made her uneasy. She had come here with a legal notice and a vague hope, but she was beginning to suspect the truth was more complicated and more important than either. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." She did not expect that simple agreement to change the entire course of her life. The spare room was clean and spare in the way that rooms are when they've been prepared with care but not sentiment. A narrow bed with a good quilt, a washstand with a ceramic basin, a small window that looked out on the barn, and beyond it, the wide, flat face of the valley rolling away toward mountains that were going purple in the evening light. Matilda stood at the window for a long time after Ira had shown her the room and left her to settle, watching the mountains change color as the sun descended, and thought about her father. Thomas Maddox had been a gentle, distracted man. He had loved maps and legal documents the way some men loved horses or whiskey, with a deep and slightly incomprehensible passion. He had taught Matilda to read a survey plot before she was 10 years old, had taken her to land offices and county courthouses as other fathers took their daughters to church picnics. She had thought she knew his business. She had thought she understood the shape of his life. But she had not known about the eastern parcel, had not known about Colorado, had not known that her father had, for nearly 20 years, held a legal claim over land that belonged, in every practical sense, to another family, and had chosen not to enforce it out of something that sounded, when she read his letter, remarkably like compassion. It made her love him more, in the strange retrospective way that death allows. And it made her miss him with a sharpness that was almost physical. She unpacked the small leather bag she had brought. A change of clothes, her father's letter, the original deed wrapped carefully in oilcloth, her mother's small silver brooch which she wore when she needed courage. She pinned the brooch to her collar, washed her face with the cold water from the ceramic basin, and went back out to help with supper whether or not she had been invited to. Ira was in the kitchen, which was adjacent to the main room and heated by the same stove's chimney. He was cutting potatoes with the methodical efficiency of a man who had been feeding himself for a long time. He glanced up when she appeared in the doorway. "You don't have to," he said. "I know." She found an apron hanging on a hook near the door and put it on. "What else are you making?" "Salt pork, beans from this morning." He pushed half the potatoes toward her side of the cutting board without further discussion. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, which was unusual, Matilda reflected, for two people who were supposed to be in an active legal dispute. She found herself noticing things about Ira Alden with the involuntary attention one pays to something interesting. The way he worked without wasted motion. The small scar that ran along the back of his right hand. The fact that he had moved the lantern closer to her side of the table so she had better light, and had done it so naturally that she was almost sure he hadn't thought about it consciously. "Tell me about the claim," she said. He kept cutting. "What do you want to know?" "Everything, from your side. What you understood about that land when you came into the ranch after your father died." Ira set down the knife. He rested both hands on the edge of the table and looked at the far wall for a moment, in the way of a man organizing something complicated in his mind. "My father bought the eastern parcel in 1865 from a man named Harlan Briggs," he said. "He paid $80 for it, which was a fair price at the time. He recorded the deed at the county office in what was then the territorial capital. He was a careful man about paperwork, my father. I know because I inherited all of it." His jaw tightened slightly. "He built the stock pond on that parcel in 1869. He ran cattle on it every summer of his life. He never had a single complaint or query from any other party. He died believing it was his." "And you believed it was yours?" "Yes." Matilda was quiet for a moment. "My father's deed was recorded in 1863 in Pueblo, but the county record systems in those years were," she searched for the right word. "A mess," Ira said. "Yes. Different offices, overlapping jurisdictions, records that weren't transferred when the territorial boundaries shifted." She picked up the knife and returned to the potatoes. "Harlan Briggs may not have known about the prior claim, or he may have known and chose not to say anything." "My lawyer thinks Briggs knew," Ira said. "He's tracked Briggs to Denver. The man died in 1881. His estate is dissolved." He said it flatly, but she heard the frustration underneath, the feeling of reaching for accountability and finding only empty air. "So there's no one to pursue for the original fraud?" "No," she agreed. "There isn't." She slid the cut potatoes into the pot. "Which means we're left with each other." Yes. And the court's ruling, which favors your claim. Yes, she said. It does. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Alden, I want you to understand something about why I came here in person rather than letting the court process play out. My father's letter was very clear. He said the land was legally mine, but he also said that justice is not always the same thing as what the law says, and that I should look at the whole situation and decide what fair actually means. She set the knife down. He built a ranch here, not my father, your father. 20 years of stock ponds and winter grass and work that made this land what it is. That's real. The law can say what it says, but that's real too. Ira looked at her with an expression that was unreadable for a moment and then became something more open, more complicated, more human. What is it you're proposing? He asked. I don't know yet, she admitted. I needed to see the land first. I needed to talk to you first. I don't want to propose something until I understand what's actually at stake. He nodded slowly. Then we'll look at it tomorrow. They ate supper at the same table where the legal notice still lay between them, and they talked. Not about the land, not yet, but about other things. Matilda told him about Kansas City, about her father's survey work, about the way Thomas Maddox had spent Sunday mornings drawing maps of places he'd never visited from descriptions he'd read in books. Ira told her, with careful brevity, about the years after his father died, about learning to manage a ranch at 25 through sheer refusal to fail, about the drought of 1880 that had nearly broken him, and the wet summer of 1881 that had saved him. They did not talk about their secrets, but they circled around them in the way that people do when they are becoming curious about someone they hadn't expected to become curious about. When she said goodnight and went to the spare room, Ira sat for a while at the table with the legal notice and a lamp and the map on the wall. He traced the boundary of the eastern parcel with one finger, 240 acres, the best water on the property, the land his cattle depended on through the winter months. He had gone to sleep for 3 years with a quiet, grinding worry about this place, about whether he could hold it together, about whether his father's dream and his own decade of work would amount to something lasting or just disappear into the valley dust like so much else. The arrival of the legal notice had felt like confirmation of the worst fear, the one he kept in the very back of his mind, that something could be taken from you not because you'd failed, but because the world was structured in ways you couldn't see and couldn't control. And now the person who held the instrument of that taking was sleeping in his spare room and had looked at him over salt pork and potatoes and said that she thought justice and what the law said were not always the same thing. He was not sure what to do with any of it. He went to bed and lay there a long time listening to the wind off the mountains, and for the first time in weeks, the particular flavor of his worry had changed into something less purely dread. Morning came in clear and cold, with the light coming over the eastern mountains like a careful announcement. Matilda was awake before it fully arrived, not from habit but from the way the spare room was oriented east, so that the first gray brightening fell across the quilt and pulled her back from sleep in a quiet and pleasant way she couldn't quite associate with waking up in a stranger's house. She dressed quickly, pinned her mother's brooch, and went out to the kitchen where Ira was already up and the coffee was already made, and he was standing on the back porch with a cup in his hand looking at the sky with the evaluating expression of a man who had learned to read weather. "Good morning," she said from the doorway. "Morning." He turned. "Sleep all right?" "Yes, surprisingly. Coffee's on the stove." She poured herself a cup and came out onto the porch to stand beside him. The valley spread out below the ranch in the early light like something from a painting, enormous and still and impossibly beautiful. The creek that ran along the eastern parcel caught the light and threw it back in slow silver movements. The mountains to the west were pale lavender turning toward blue. The cattle were already moving in the lower pasture, their shapes dark and unhurried against the pale grass. "Is that the eastern parcel?" she asked, nodding toward the creek. "The creek is the boundary. Everything east of it to that ridge is the parcel." She studied it. She had looked at the deed, had read the descriptions in legal language that reduced land to measurements and coordinates, but seeing it was something different. It was beautiful land. It had the kind of quiet richness that only reveals itself over time, the way the creek carved its way between banks thick with cottonwood, the way the grass held a different quality of green along the water, the way the morning light lay in the sheltered eastern ground longer than it did on the open valley. "My father never saw it," she said. "How do you know?" "His letter. He wrote that he had purchased it from descriptions and survey notes in 1863 and had never had occasion to travel to Colorado himself." She drank her coffee. "He owned a beautiful piece of land he never laid eyes on. It happens." Ira was looking at the parcel too. Land in the West was bought and sold like that constantly. Survey notes and descriptions, and half the time the surveys were wrong anyway. "He meant to come," Matilda said. "There were plans in his papers from different years. He kept meaning to come to Colorado, and then something would happen, my mother's illness, his own work, the war years, and it kept not happening." She felt the familiar tightness in her chest. He was a man who kept meaning to do things and then running out of time. Ira turned and looked at her. She was looking at the creek, and he watched her profile, the serious angle of her face, the small brooch catching the light, and thought that she was carrying more than a legal dispute into this valley. She was carrying grief that had nowhere to put itself. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you the parcel properly, on horseback." She turned. "I ride," she said. "I figured." He saddled his own horse, a solid bay named Hector, and a smaller gray mare named Alice that he kept for when riders came who needed something steadier. He watched Matilda mount Alice with clean, easy competence, not showy but entirely sure of herself, and thought again about the layers of this woman that kept revealing themselves in ways that wrong-footed his initial assumptions. They rode east along the fence line in the early morning quiet. The air was cold enough to see their breath and warm enough to be comfortable in movement. Ira pointed out the boundaries as they rode, explaining what he knew of the land's history, where the stock pond was, where the winter grass held longest, where the creek ran deepest. Matilda listened and looked and asked precise questions. She had her father's survey habits, he realized. She wanted to understand a thing thoroughly before she rendered any judgment on it. He found he respected that more than he would have expected. At the north corner of the parcel, where the land rose slightly before dropping down toward the creek, they stopped on a small natural rise and looked out over the whole extent of it. From here you could see both the way the parcel fit into the larger ranch and the way it was also its own complete thing, self-contained and beautiful. "What do you want?" Ira asked. She turned to look at him. The question, he realized, was too broad and too sudden, and he adjusted it. "From the land claim, what is the outcome you actually want?" Matilda was quiet for a long moment. A hawk crossed above them, unhurried, tilting on the updraft. "My father left me nothing except this claim," she said carefully. "I have $32 in a postal account in Kansas City and a room in a boarding house that I've already given up to come here. I have no family beyond the occasional distant cousin who has no interest in my circumstances." She met his eyes. "I need something that can sustain me. That's the honest truth, and I'd rather you hear it from me than have to guess at it." Ira absorbed this. The directness of it, the lack of pretense or maneuvering, was unexpected and somehow bracing. He had been braced for tactics. This was not tactics. This was a person telling him the truth in circumstances where the truth was embarrassing and she had told it anyway. "All right," he said. "Here's my honest truth. This parcel is not just the best land I have. It's the land the ranch depends on to winter the herd. Without it, I'd have to reduce the herd by at least a third, maybe more. I'd survive, but I'd lose a decade of building." He looked out over the creek. "I cannot simply give you 240 acres and watch the ranch break." "I don't want to break the ranch," she said immediately. "That's not what my father asked me to do." "Then what?" The hawk circled once more and was gone. The creek made its small, persistent sound below them. "I've been thinking," Matilda said slowly. about what my father actually intended. He was a meticulous man. He kept a legal claim for 20 years without enforcing it, but he filed the notice before he died. I think he was trying to preserve something for me, but I also think he would have hated what an outright taking would do. She looked at Ira. Is there a way to structure something that gives me a right to a portion of what the land produces, rather than taking the land itself? Ira went very still. It was not the stillness of rejection. It was the stillness of a man who has been offered something unexpected and is working out carefully what it means. A lease arrangement, he said, or something like it, something legal and binding that gives me an income from the parcel without removing it from the ranch's operations. She held his gaze. The land stays under your management. The cattle winter there as they always have. But the Maddox claim is acknowledged and compensated in a formal way that the court would validate. You'd give up the deed. I'd exchange the deed for a recorded agreement. A legal income interest in the parcel's productivity, documented and enforceable. She hesitated. It's not what the letter of my father's instructions said, but I think it's what he would have meant if he'd had time to think it through properly. Ira Alden looked at Matilda Maddox for a long time. The morning light had grown full and warm while they talked, and she sat on Alice with her back straight and her dark eyes serious and her father's brooch at her collar, and he thought about all the traps and hidden motives he had been imagining in the weeks since the legal notice arrived, and how none of them looked anything like this. I need to talk to my lawyer, he said. This week. Will you stay while I send for Purcell? You're asking me to stay. I'm asking you to stay, he confirmed, because I'd rather solve this with you in the room than from a distance. She nodded slowly, and something in her face loosened very slightly, not quite relief but adjacent to it. Yes, she said. I'll stay. They rode back to the ranch house in the gold October light, and neither of them said anything more, but the silence between them had changed its character entirely. Purcell arrived from Alamosa 2 days later on a good roan horse with saddlebags full of documents, and the slightly harassed expression of a lawyer who had been managing an impossible situation, and had now discovered that it had become, against all probability, more complicated. He was a small, careful man of about 50 with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the habit of taking them off and cleaning them when he was processing something difficult. He cleaned them 4 times during the first hour of conversation. Ira had asked Mrs. Castillo to come an extra day that week. She was a compact, practical woman of Mexican descent, whose family had been in the San Luis Valley far longer than any rancher, and she managed Ira's household with serene authority and a gift for producing food that made Ira realize, periodically, how sparely he had been feeding himself before she started coming. She made coffee and brought out food, and regarded Matilda with bright, assessing eyes that reserved judgment with great dignity. The 3 of them sat at the table with Purcell's documents and both deeds spread between them. Ira watched Matilda read through the legal papers with the focused attention of someone who had grown up understanding such documents, and saw Purcell notice it too, with a flicker of surprised respect behind the wire-rimmed glasses. Miss Maddox, Purcell said eventually, you understand that the court's ruling does give you a strong position. You could pursue full title restoration. I understand, Matilda said. I'm choosing not to. May I ask why? She looked at Ira. He did not look away. Because I think the right outcome is one that acknowledges both claims without destroying what's been built here, she said, and because I believe the law should be in service of fairness, not the other way around. Purcell cleaned his glasses. That's a very philosophical position for a land dispute. My father was a philosophical man, Matilda said. I inherited some of it along with the deed. What followed was 3 days of intense, careful work. Purcell drafted language. Matilda read it and asked questions that made Purcell revise it. Ira sat at the end of the table and contributed his own knowledge of what the land produced and what a fair calculation of its annual value would be, because he knew those numbers better than anyone and would not allow vagueness to let either of them down later. The agreement they arrived at was this. Matilda Maddox would convey her title interest in the eastern parcel back to the Alden Ranch in exchange for a recorded income interest equal to 12% of the parcel's annual livestock revenue, payable each October, enforceable in the territorial court. The agreement would run for 20 years, after which both parties or their heirs could renegotiate or dissolve it. The original Maddox deed would be formally retired and the Alden deed confirmed. It was not a perfect solution. Purcell said so several times, but it was a fair one, which was rarer and Matilda thought more valuable. On the evening of the third day, when Purcell had gone back to a limosa with signed copies of everything, Ira and Matilda sat on the back porch with coffee, and the last of a dry spell's good weather, watching the stars come out over the mountains in the cold, clear dark. "It's done," she said. "Yes." A long pause. The stars were extraordinary out here, she thought, nothing like what she had seen from Kansas City windows. "What will you do now?" Ira asked. She had been thinking about this all day, turning it over carefully. "Go back to Kansas City, I suppose, find work. I can do accounting, surveying assistance, legal copying. My father taught me well." She said it practically because she was a practical person, but there was something underneath the practical words that was less settled, less certain. "You don't want to go back," Ira said. It was not a question. She looked at him. "Am I that obvious?" "No. But you've been looking at that valley for 3 days like it's the first thing you've seen in a long time that makes sense to you." Matilda was quiet for a moment. The observation was startlingly accurate. She had grown up in cities, in the horizontal world of streets and buildings and the compressed life of urban Kansas, and she had never known what she was missing until she had stood on that rise above the creek and looked out at a piece of the world that was open and old and real in a way she couldn't quite name. "My father spent his life looking at places like this on maps," she said softly. "I think I finally understand why." Ira set down his cup. He turned to look at her and she felt the weight of his attention, not uncomfortable but significant, the way important things feel in the moment before they become important. "There's work here," he said carefully. "Real work. The ranch keeps books, ranch correspondence, land records, livestock accounts. Mrs. Castillo is wonderful, but she's not a bookkeeper. I've been managing it myself and I'm not naturally organized." He paused. "I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you work that needs doing and a wage I can sustain." She stared at him. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a reason to stay if you want one." He held her gaze with the steady directness she had come to recognize as simply who he was. "The valley is worth staying for. You said so yourself, even if not in those words." Matilda looked at the mountains and thought about the boarding house in Kansas City that she had given up, the $32 in the postal account, the life that awaited her in a city that felt increasingly like a place she had already finished with. She thought about Mrs. Hargrove's mule, which she would need to return, and wondered if this was how large decisions felt. Not like a door opening, but like simply noticing that you are already walking through one. "I'll need my own wages separate from the income agreement," she said finally. "The agreement stands on its own terms. If I work here, I work for fair pay, not as part of a package." "Obviously," Ira said. "And I'll need a place to stay that isn't your spare room indefinitely. There's a small cabin south of the main house. My foreman used it before he married and moved to Garnet. It's been empty for 2 years. It needs work, but the structure is sound." She looked at him. He looked at her. The stars were fully out now, brilliant and cold and vast. "All right," Matilda said. "All right," Ira agreed. And neither of them said anything more, but the quiet between them was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the season. The weeks that followed were the strangest and best of Matilda's recent memory. She returned Mrs. Hargrove's wagon and mule with a letter of thanks, and a jar of the preserves that Mrs. Castillo had sent along for the purpose, then came back to the ranch on the seat of Ira's supply wagon, sitting beside a quiet man with a bag of dry goods in the back, and the mountains catching the afternoon light all around them. And it felt, impossibly, like coming home. She moved into the south cabin, which was small and low-ceilinged and smelled of old wood and years of disuse. She spent 3 days cleaning it with aggressive thoroughness while Ira and his two hands, a Mexican man named Raphael and a young fellow from Missouri named Clark, replaced the broken window and fixed the stovepipe and chinked the worst of the wall gaps. Clark, who was 22 and had the kind of relentless cheerfulness that you either found charming or exhausting, brought her a bunch of dried wildflowers from somewhere and set them on the windowsill without a word, which she found unexpectedly touching. She set up the books on the first day of November and spent a week getting them into order, which required a level of focused patience that she was good at, and that Ira watched with a mixture of relief and admiration. The ranch's accounts had been kept in a system that was more archaeological than organizational, layers of receipts and ledger entries, and remembered agreements that she had to excavate carefully to reconstruct an accurate picture. When she presented Ira with a proper set of organized accounts at the kitchen table one evening, with the current position summarized on the front page in clear columns, she watched him read through it with an expression that moved from attention to something that looked almost like wonder. "I didn't know it was this good," he said. "It's better than good," she said. "You've been running this ranch in a state of mild financial anxiety for no reason. The numbers are strong." He looked up. "I've been worried for a long time. I know. The anxiety is visible in the way the accounts were kept, honestly, but the actual position is solid." She leaned across the table and pointed to a figure. "Here's what you actually made this year through September. Here's the projection through December. You're not in trouble, Mr. Alden. You're in a better position than most ranches I've seen records of." Ira sat back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. Something left him, she thought. Some long-held tightness that had lived in him so long he'd stopped noticing it. "Call me Ira," he said. She smiled. "All right, Ira." He returned the smile with one of his own, slow and genuine, and she thought, there it is. That was the first time she had seen him fully smile, and it was devastating in the quiet way of things you are not prepared for. "Matilda," he said, trying it out like someone testing the weight of a word. "Yes, thank you. You're paying me wages," she said. "Thank Mrs. Hargrove." He laughed briefly but genuinely, and the room felt warmer. The friendship between them deepened in the way that friendships deepen when two people are thrown into close, purposeful proximity with each other and are both honest enough to stop pretending they aren't paying close attention. They had supper together most evenings because it was practical and because the conversations were good. She discovered that he had strong opinions about books, particularly about history, that he had read more than she had expected and thought carefully about what he read. He discovered that she had her father's gift for exact, pointed observation and a dry sense of humor that she deployed rarely but precisely. They rode out together on weekends when the work allowed it, checking the fence lines and the herd and the winter condition of the parcel, and these rides became the part of the week that Matilda found herself looking forward to with an intensity that she tried, at first, to rationalize as simple appreciation for the landscape. It was not the landscape. By early December, 2 months after she had arrived with the legal notice, she was fully aware of what was happening to her in the vicinity of Ira Alden, and the awareness was both thrilling and frightening. She was not naive about the dangers of her position. She was a woman alone in a man's working environment, financially dependent on the agreement they had made, living on his property, eating at his table. She could not afford to confuse gratitude or practical warmth for something more dangerous. She could not afford to make a mistake that would undo the careful, fair structure they had built. She kept her feelings like a secret she was keeping from herself. The inner negotiations of this were exhausting. What she did not know was that Ira was conducting very similar negotiations on his side of the invisible line they had both drawn. He was a man who trusted his own judgment in most things, but in this particular domain he did not trust it at all, because the last time he had trusted it, the results had been painful. Her name had been Alina, and she had come through the valley in 1881 with her brother's cattle drive, And Ira had allowed himself to believe that a woman who laughed at his jokes and walked through his fields with genuine interest had feelings that matched what he was developing. He had been wrong. Alina had been pleasant and interested in a general way that had nothing specifically to do with him. And when the cattle drive moved on, she had moved with it without a backward look. And Ira had spent 6 months of the following winter being meticulous and quiet, and working entirely too hard, which was how he processed things. He was not going to make the same error with Matilda Maddox. Especially not when the situation was complicated by the legal agreement and the professional arrangement, and the fact that she was living on his land, and he could not allow her to feel, even for a moment, that her position here was contingent on something she had not agreed to. So he kept his feelings too, folded away and managed with the same careful discipline he applied to everything difficult, and let the friendship deepen without crossing the line he had set himself, and thought that this was probably the right thing, even when it required him to sit across the supper table from her and listen to her talk and feel the ongoing, extraordinary difficulty of that restraint. The one who broke through both their defenses was, of all possible catalysts, Mrs. Castillo. She was not an obvious matchmaker. She was a woman of profound practical sense who had been married to her husband Felipe for 31 years, and regarded excessive romantic sentiment with mild amusement, as one regards the antics of young cattle. But she was also a woman who watched, and what she watched at the Alden Ranch kitchen table over those early winter weeks was two people treating each other with an extraordinary, careful tenderness that both of them were working very hard to disguise as practicality. On a Tuesday in mid-December, when Matilda was copying ranch correspondence at the kitchen table and Ira was out at the barn, Mrs. Castillo poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down uninvited. Matilda looked up. Mrs. Castillo set 1 cup in front of her with the authority of someone who had made a decision. "You are afraid," Mrs. Castillo said. Matilda opened her mouth to deny it and then closed it again. "Is it that obvious?" Only to someone paying attention. Mrs. Castillo folded her hands around her own cup. "He is also afraid, in case you are wondering." Matilda set down her pen. "Mrs. Castillo, the situation is complicated. Situations are always complicated. People make them so because they are afraid of simple things." She regarded Matilda with the warm, slightly impatient frankness of a woman who had lived long enough to find elaborate emotional caution somewhat tedious. "What simple thing are you afraid of?" Matilda thought about Alina, whom she knew nothing about, and about the legal agreement, and about the cabin south of the house, and about the way she felt when Ira smiled slowly across a kitchen table. "I'm afraid," she said carefully, "of mistaking warmth for more than it is." "And what do you think it is?" A long pause. Outside she could hear the barn sounds, the livestock settling, the distant call of one of the hands. "I think it might be more than warmth," she said quietly. Mrs. Castillo nodded once, as if this confirmed something she had already known. "He is a good man," she said simply. "He was good before you came, and he is better since." "That is not nothing." She stood up, smoothed her apron with decisive hands. "Whether you do something about it is your business. I only thought you should know what you already know." She went back to her work and left Matilda sitting with the coffee and the correspondence and the knowledge that had been waiting politely for her to acknowledge it. That evening at supper, the quality of Matilda's silence was different. Ira noticed immediately, because he noticed most things about her by now, though he had not spoken of this to anyone including himself. "Something wrong?" he asked. "No," she said. "Then, actually, I want to ask you something, and I would like you to answer honestly even if the answer is awkward." He set down his fork. "All right." She looked at him directly, in the way she had of meeting things without flinching. "Is what exists between us something that you have chosen not to act on for reasons, or is it simply nothing that I have misread as something?" The silence that followed was the most electrically charged moment Ira had experienced since the paper had shaken in his hands in his doorway 2 months ago. He met her eyes. He thought about Alina, and the 6 winter months and the discipline he had spent 8 weeks exercising, and thought, enough. It is very much something, he said, that I have not acted on for reasons. Matilda breathed out slowly. What reasons? The agreement, your position here. I didn't want you to feel that anything was expected of you beyond what we agreed to. Something crossed her face, a softness that he hadn't seen before, warm and a little undone. Ira, she said, the agreement is recorded with the territorial court. My position here is legally established and entirely independent of anything between us personally. I designed it that way. She held his gaze. I designed it that way on purpose. He stared at her. You designed it. I needed to be sure that whatever happened between us, my security didn't depend on it. She said it plainly, without apology. My father raised me to think ahead. I thought ahead. Ira looked at this woman, at her serious face and the brooch at her collar, and the 10 weeks of shared suppers and horseback rides and honest conversations, and felt something that had been very carefully held in place simply release. That is the most practical thing anyone has ever said to me, he told her. I am a very practical person. Matilda. He said her name the way he had that first time, like he was checking the weight of it. Would you allow me to call on you, properly? In the way a man calls on a woman he intends to pursue seriously and honorably. Her expression was doing something complicated and beautiful. You want to court me? Yes, that is what I want. She was quiet for a moment, and he thought he might have said it wrong or badly, and then she said, Yes, Ira, I'll allow it. He smiled then, the slow, genuine smile she found devastating, and she smiled back, and the kitchen was warm and the food was getting cold, and neither of them cared at all. Courtship on a working ranch in 1884 in the San Luis Valley of Colorado had a particular texture that was different from the courtship Matilda had read about in the novels she'd borrowed from various lending libraries over the years. There were no parlor calls with calling cards and chaperones and careful conversation over tea. There was instead the slow accumulation of days made deliberately warmer and more conscious, the same work and the same shared evenings and the same horseback rides, but with the mutual acknowledgement now that these things had a particular meaning. Ira brought her wildflowers in December, which surprised him because it was December and there were no wildflowers. But he had asked Mrs. Castillo, and she had produced, from somewhere, a bunch of dried mountain flowers in gold and rust and brown that she said kept their color all winter, and that Matilda put in a jar on her cabin windowsill next to Clark's original bunch and looked at every morning when she woke up. He wrote to her. This surprised both of them because they saw each other every day and correspondence seemed unnecessary. But Ira had discovered that there were things easier to say on paper than across a kitchen table, and he left notes at her cabin door that were careful and honest in the way he was careful and honest in all things, and she read them by lamplight and kept them in a tin box with her father's letter and the silver brooch when she wasn't wearing it. She read to him in the evening sometimes, from the books on his shelf, or from the ones she had sent for from a limosa, and he would sit across the room with some piece of work in his hands and listen with the total, absorbed attention of a man who found the voice doing the reading as interesting as what was being read. On Christmas Day, which they celebrated quietly with Mrs. Castillo and her husband Felipe and the Hands, Raphael and Clark and 2 others who had nowhere else to be, Ira gave Matilda a compass. It was a good one, brass with a glass face and a clear true needle, the kind a surveyor would use. She turned it over in her hands, then looked up at him. So you always know where you are, he said simply. She kissed him for the first time then in front of Mrs. Castillo and Felipe and the assembled ranch hands, which caused Clark to let out a single surprised sound of satisfaction that nobody acknowledged but everyone heard. January was hard the way Colorado January is always hard, with cold that came in off the mountains with serious intent and settled over the valley like a moral position. But the cattle were well wintered on the eastern parcel exactly as Ira had planned, and the accounts that Matilda had organized showed the ranch's position clearly enough that Ira could face the hard month without the particular icy finger of financial worry that had become habitual. He and Matilda were both people who showed love through labor and honesty and carefully chosen words, and the month shaped itself around these currencies naturally. She reorganized the barn record system, which had been even more archaeological than the financial books, and he taught her the difference between first cut and second cut hay, and why it mattered, and how to read the condition of a cow in winter, practical knowledge that she absorbed with the focused pleasure of someone learning something she intends to use. In February, Ira drove them both to Garnet in the wagon to file paperwork at the county office, and had supper afterward at the hotel restaurant, which was the most formally social thing they had done. And sitting across from her at a table with a cloth on it while she wore the blue dress that was better than her everyday dress, he thought about the future in a way that was new to him, specific rather than abstract. Populated with her particular face and voice, and the way she bit the end of her pen when she was concentrating. In March, when the first thaw came and the valley began its long, slow return to green, he asked her to walk with him to the rise above the eastern parcel, which had become a place of particular meaning between them, the place where they had first really talked about what the land dispute actually meant, the first place she had looked at the valley and felt it look back. They stood there in the thin spring sunlight with the creek sparkling and the first green pushing up through the old grass and the mountains enormous and white-capped to the west. "I love you," Ira said. He said it the way he said most important things, directly and without decoration, looking at her with those gray eyes that never looked away from the things they were looking at. Matilda had known it was coming, because she was a perceptive woman, and because it had been coming in every practiced, patient, generous thing he had done for months, but hearing it said aloud in the March light above the creek hit her somewhere so essential that for a moment she couldn't speak. "I love you too," she said. "I have for longer than I've admitted to anyone, including myself." He reached over and took her hand, and she linked her fingers through his, and they stood there looking at the valley and the land that had brought them together through an improbable sequence of events involving a dead man's deed and a borrowed wagon, and a piece of paper that had shaken in a rancher's hands on an October morning, and it seemed to both of them in that moment that the world was very precisely and correctly arranged. "I want to ask you to marry me," Ira said, "but I want to ask properly." "When the timing is right." "When is right?" she asked. "When you feel settled enough that the answer comes from what you want and not from where you are or what you depend on." She turned to look at him. There it was again, that quality of him, the care he took to clear the space around a thing so it could be freely chosen rather than pressed into shape by circumstances. It was rare. She had not known how rare until she experienced its opposite in the world. "Ira," she said, "I have a compass now. I always know where I am." She squeezed his hand. "Ask me." He turned to face her fully. The wind came up from the valley and moved her hair, and she didn't bother trying to hold it down because she was looking at him. "Matilda Maddox," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will." The spring moved around them, enormous and indifferent to the human scale of the moment, and they stood in it together and let it. The wedding was in May. It was not a large affair, because neither of them was a person who wanted a large affair, but it was a good one. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, who came through Garnet on a monthly rotation, a compact man named Reverend Wiley, who had a gift for brevity and sincerity in roughly equal measure, and who had performed ceremonies in schoolhouses, barns, and on at least one occasion the back of a moving wagon, and who regarded outdoor ceremonies in a ranch yard in May as entirely reasonable. Mrs. Castillo had commandeered the kitchen for 2 days beforehand with a level of organizational authority that Ira did not dare question, and the results were extraordinary. Mrs. Castillo's daughter Esperanza, who was 17 and had a gift for arranging things, decorated the yard with cottonwood branches and ribbons. Matilda wore a dress of dove gray wool that she had made herself over the winter, with a seriousness of purpose that had occasionally made Clark stop doing useful things in the vicinity of the cabin just to observe the window. She wore her mother's brooch. She carried a bunch of early spring flowers from the creek bank that Ira had gathered that morning before she was awake and left outside her cabin door with a note that said only, "For today." She kept the note. Raphael played the fiddle. Ira stood in the yard in his good clothes with an expression that Matilda, walking toward him across the packed earth, thought was the most unguarded she had ever seen his face, open and present and full of something that had no other word than love. The ceremony was simple and true. They said the words that had been said by millions of people across every kind of circumstance and country and century, and the words were not diminished by their repetition. If anything, they were enlarged by it, by the weight of everyone who had said them before and meant them. They ate and drank, and Raphael played until the evening came in purple and gold, and Mrs. Castillo cried, which she did with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything else, and Clark made a speech that was somehow both embarrassing and touching, and Felipe shook Ira's hand with the firm, brief sincerity of a man who had known him a long time. When everyone had gone home and the yard was quiet and the mountains were dark shapes against the star-scattered sky, Ira and Matilda stood together on the back porch for a moment before going in. "Well," said Matilda. "Well," said Ira. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the valley in the dark, and he put his arm around her and felt the particular rightness of it, the way some things, once found, cannot be imagined as unfound. Summer arrived fully, bringing the long days and serious heat that turned the valley gold and kept the hands busy from before dawn to after dusk with the work of it. Matilda had slid into the life of the ranch, not as an addition to something already complete, but as a presence that revealed what it had been missing, which was a different thing and a better one. She kept the books with the same meticulous precision she had brought to the initial organization, but she had expanded the scope of them now, tracking patterns across seasons, noting which pastures produced better forage in which years, cross-referencing the livestock records with the weather notes she had begun keeping in a separate ledger. She was building, with the focused pleasure of someone doing work that uses all of her abilities, a longitudinal record of the ranch that would allow them to make better decisions and anticipate problems, and understand the land in a more complete way. Ira watched this with the admiring attention of a man who recognizes intelligence operating at full capacity and knows it. He was also, as the summer deepened, watching her with a different kind of attention, the kind that notices changes before they are announced. By August, he was fairly certain of something, and by the first week of September, he was entirely certain, and he was waiting for her to tell him in her own time. She told him on a Tuesday morning in mid-September, before breakfast, sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap and the compass he'd given her on the nightstand. "We're going to have a child," she said. "Probably in March if the timing is what I think it is." Ira sat down beside her. He took her hands. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was the first thing. "I'm well," she said, tired and slightly unreliable on horseback first thing in the morning, but well. "March," he said. The word had weight. He turned it over in his mind and found it full of things he didn't have language for yet, large and warm and frightening and good. "March," she agreed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat there for a moment in the morning quiet, with the sound of the ranch starting up outside and the mountains going gold in the early light and the small, extraordinary fact of the future rearranging itself around them. "Your father would have liked this," Ira said. Matilda was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "He would have." She turned her face into his shoulder briefly. "He would have drawn a map of the baby's room." Ira laughed, soft and real, and held her closer. The fall of 1885 moved with the particular intensity of a season full of known meaning. Matilda continued working as her condition allowed, adapting her methods as needed with the same practical, unsentimental competence she applied to everything, though she admitted privately to Ira that she found it irritating when her body did not cooperate with her schedule. He found this admission charming, and did not say so because he had learned which observations she wanted back and which she wanted absorbed without comment. They prepared. The small cabin that had been hers was cleaned out and reorganized as a proper spare space, since she had long since moved fully into the main house. The room adjacent to theirs, which had been used for storage, was cleared and cleaned and fitted with a crib that Ira built himself over the course of 3 evenings in the barn, with Raphael assisting, and Clark providing unhelpful suggestions that occasionally turned into helpful ones. Mrs. Castillo came more frequently as winter deepened, ostensibly to help with the house, but actually, Matilda suspected, to monitor the situation with the focused concern of a woman who had seen enough frontier births to know that things needed watching. She brought her cousin Maria, who had experience as a midwife, in January to meet Matilda and assess and prepare. Maria was a small, capable woman who spoke with directness and examined Matilda with brisk, confident hands, and said everything looked right and good, and she would come when she was needed. March arrived with a false spring, 3 warm days that made the valley green and fooled people into hopefulness before a cold snap came back in with sharp intent. On the 6th of March, in the main bedroom of the Alden Ranch house, while Ira waited in the kitchen with Raphael and Clark, who had both found reasons to be in the general vicinity and were pretending to play cards, Matilda's son was born. He was large and loud and absolutely furious about the entire experience of arriving in the world, and he had Ira's gray eyes already, or what Matilda said looked like the beginnings of gray eyes, though Mrs. Castillo said all babies' eyes started dark and you couldn't know yet, and Matilda said she knew. Ira came in when Maria called him and stood by the bed and looked at the person in Matilda's arms with an expression that Matilda would remember for the rest of her life, absolute wonder, completely unguarded and total. "Hello," he said to the baby, with the same directness he brought to all important things. The baby stared at him with the unfocused ancient gaze of the newly arrived. "His name is Thomas," Matilda said. She had told Ira this weeks ago, and he had said yes immediately, without having to think about it. "Thomas Alden," Ira said, trying it out. "Thomas Gerald Alden," Matilda said. "One for my father and one for yours." Ira looked at her then, and whatever was in his face then was beyond what she could describe precisely, but she felt it as clearly as if it were a physical thing. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she leaned against him with their son between them. In the March afternoon, with the cold snap holding outside and the stove warm inside, and the mountains going on forever beyond the window, and the life they had built together arranged itself around the 3 of them, with a completeness that neither of them had known how to ask for and both of them had somehow found. In the days that followed, the ranch settled into the new rhythm of itself with something that felt like a satisfied exhalation. Clark, who could not stop smiling about the baby in a way that was excessive but endearing, carved a small horse out of pine that was surprisingly good. Raphael's wife Concepcion came out from Garnet with a blanket she had made and stayed for supper, and told Matilda things about nursing and sleeping and babies that Matilda wrote down in a new ledger dedicated to the purpose, which made Concepcion laugh with warm affection at the kind of woman who kept records of everything. Mrs. Castillo, who had claimed for years that she was well past being moved by babies, held Thomas Gerald Alden on a Thursday afternoon and looked at his face with an expression that suggested she had perhaps overstated her immunity. The legal agreement that Matilda had negotiated with Purcell continued to operate exactly as designed. The first payment from the Eastern Parcel's productivity had been made the previous October, calculated against the ledgers Matilda kept herself, and documented properly. She had been scrupulous about keeping that thread entirely separate from everything personal, just as she had planned, and it stood as a clean, independent thing in the territorial record. The Maddox interest in the Alden Eastern parcel, fair and enforceable, acknowledged by both parties, an annual reminder that the truth of how they had come together was not something to be embarrassed about but something to be kept clearly legible. Purcell came out from a limosa in May with copies of the updated records and congratulations on the birth, and a look of undisguised satisfaction at a legal arrangement that had, against his initial professional skepticism, produced something genuinely good. He stayed for supper and told them that he had heard of 2 other parcel disputes in the territory that were following a similar framework to theirs for resolution, which he attributed partly to the fact that their agreement had been cited as precedent in one of the Alamosa court's decisions. "You started something," he told Matilda. "My father started it," she said. "I just finished it properly." "He would be pleased," Purcell said, and meant it. She thought about that on the walk back from seeing him off, Thomas asleep against her shoulder in the evening air, Ira beside her. She thought about her father drawing maps on Sunday mornings and keeping a deed in a box for 20 years because he did not think it was right to ruin a decent man, and writing a letter to her in his last weeks that said, "Figure out what fair means." She had figured it out. She had built it, literally, into a document recorded with the territorial court and cited by other courts. She had turned her father's unfinished intention into something that would exist past both of their lifetimes. "Thank you," she said to Ira quietly. He looked at her. "For what?" "For asking me to come inside." He was quiet for a moment, remembering the doorway, the paper shaking in his hands, the woman on the wagon with the borrowed mule and the dark, watchful eyes, and the thing he had not entirely understood at the time about why he had held the door open wider. "I think," he said, "that was probably the best decision I have ever made." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and Thomas stirred and settled, and the evening was gold over the mountains. The years that followed were good ones, which is not to say they were easy, because nothing in that country in that time was easy, but they were full and honest and richly textured with the substance of a life being genuinely lived. The ranch grew steadily, not rashly, with the careful intention of people who understood what it had cost to build it and did not intend to lose it to the false enthusiasm of overextension. By 1887, they had added 50 head to the herd and expanded the hay operation to include a second cutting field along the south pasture. By 1888, they had hired a third full-time hand, a quiet Pueblo man named Alejandro who had worked cattle since he was 14 and who turned out to be one of the most capable men Ira had ever employed. Matilda's record-keeping had by then evolved into something that was recognized beyond the ranch. Purcell had mentioned it to a colleague in Denver, who had mentioned it to a land management office that was trying to establish better frameworks for ranch productivity documentation in the territory. In 1887, a man from that office came to the ranch to talk to Matilda about the system she had developed, and left 4 hours later with detailed notes and an expression of slightly dazed admiration. 2 of her methods were adopted as recommendations in the Territorial Land Management Guidelines published in 1888, which she noted in her journal with characteristic understatement as an interesting development. Thomas Gerald Alden grew from an outraged arrival into a cheerful, serious-eyed boy who walked the fence lines with his father before he was old enough to work them, who sat with his mother in the ledger room asking questions that were too sharp for his age, who learned to ride on Alice the gray mare with a competence that made Raphael nod with professional approval. In the spring of 1889, Matilda told Ira on a Tuesday morning that Thomas was going to have company. She said it with a small smile that she had been working very hard to contain since the previous evening. Ira, who was in the middle of reading a seed catalog, set it down and looked at her with the same expression he'd had 4 years earlier, total, unguarded wonder. "November, I think," she said. "November," he repeated. "Are you going to count on another boy?" she asked. "I'm not going to count on anything," he said. "I'm just going to be grateful." She crossed the room and he stood, and they held each other in the morning kitchen with the coffee still hot, and the catalog on the table and the mountains in the window, and the thing that existed between them, which had begun as a crisis and grown through honesty and respect and shared labor, and chosen love into something so solid and warm and permanent that the word for it barely contained it, settled comfortably around them like a house that has learned to fit its inhabitants. Their daughter arrived in November, which was the most dramatic possible month for an arrival in a Colorado ranch in terms of weather, and she came in the middle of a 3-day snowstorm with Maria, the midwife, stranded inside, and Ira sitting in the kitchen again with Raphael and Alejandro, playing cards with a focus that was entirely performative. She was named Clara, for no particular historical reason, but because when Ira held her and Matilda said, "What do you think?" He had said, "She looks like a Clara," and Matilda had agreed without argument, which was how that was settled. Clara turned out to have her mother's precise, watching nature and her father's gray eyes, and a temperament that was entirely her own, forthright and vivid, and given to opinions expressed with remarkable clarity, even before she had the vocabulary to fully support them. Thomas regarded his sister with the wariness of a 5-year-old who had been the singular center of a household's attention, and could see immediately that this arrangement was being revised. And then, within approximately 2 weeks, with the complete and slightly ferocious protectiveness that firstborns sometimes develop once they understand what they are protecting. Ira watched his children with the private amazement of a man who had not, honestly, believed that this particular fullness of life was available to him, and found that the amazement did not diminish with familiarity, but deepened in the way that real things do. Matilda watched him watch them, and felt, regularly, the vast and quiet gratitude of someone who has arrived somewhere they had not known to look for and found it entirely real. The summer of 1890 brought a complication that had been building for years and could not be further avoided. The water rights along the creek that fed the eastern parcel were being contested by a new ranching operation that had come into the valley south of them, a larger enterprise backed by outside investment money, with the particular aggressive confidence of people who had capital and intended to use it. Their claim was that their upstream position on the creek gave them rights to divert water that had, in practice, always flowed through the Alden parcel. It was the kind of dispute that could go badly in the territorial court if not properly handled, because water rights in Colorado in 1890 were a battlefield on which fortunes and ranches regularly fell, and the legal framework was still being constructed through the accumulation of court decisions, many of which contradicted each other. Ira went to Purcell, who had been expecting this call. Matilda went with him, with her ledgers, which documented 26 years of water flow records that she had painstakingly reconstructed from her father's papers and Gerald Alden's original notes, and her own 7 years of meticulous documentation. The records showed clearly and consistently the historical water use patterns and the pre-existing claims that predated the new operation's arrival by decades. The dispute took 8 months and cost money and emotional energy that would have been better spent elsewhere, but the records held. Purcell argued the case with the documented evidence that Matilda's record-keeping had made unassailable, and in the spring of 1891, the territorial court ruled in favor of the Alden Ranch's water rights with a clarity that Purcell said, with quiet professional satisfaction, would serve as precedent for other cases in the valley. Afterward, walking out of the courthouse in a limosa into the bright spring air, Ira stopped on the courthouse steps and looked at Matilda with an expression that had layers to it. "You know what your ledgers just did," he said. "They documented the truth," she said. "They saved the ranch." He said it simply. Again. She thought about the first time, the legal notice in a borrowed wagon and a woman who had come 40 miles to negotiate fairly, and the rancher who had asked her to come inside, and everything that had grown from that single act of openness. "Your father built something worth saving," she said. "So did you. "So did you," he said. She took his hand on the courthouse steps in the spring light, and they walked to the wagon together. Thomas was 8 by the spring of 1893, and already showing the particular combination of his parents' qualities that made people who knew them smile: Matilda's precision and Ira's steadiness, and something entirely his own, a genuine warmth with people that neither parent fully claimed responsibility for but both recognized with fond bafflement. He had taken to spending time with Raphael learning the horsework, and with Alejandro learning the cattle management, absorbing the practical knowledge of the ranch with the focused pleasure of a child who already knew, in the wordless way children sometimes do, that this place was going to be his life, and he might as well understand all of it. Clara, at 4, was conducting an ongoing study of everything. She followed Mrs. Castillo around the kitchen asking questions, until Mrs. Castillo, who had in 4 years developed a deep and slightly exasperated love for this child, answered them all with the patience of someone who understood that questions were how Clara assembled the world. She followed Matilda into the ledger room and sat on the floor with her own scrap paper, making marks that she called her numbers. She followed Ira to the barn and asked about the horses with the intensity of a small scientist examining a new phenomenon. Ira told her everything she asked, because he had learned from Matilda that answering questions seriously was the best way to raise someone who thought seriously, and because Clara's questions, honestly, were often more interesting than they had any right to be at 4 years old. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet and the mountains were dark against the star-thick sky, Ira and Matilda sat together in the main room with the same lamp that had been there when she first walked through the door in October 1884, and the same books on the same shelf, and the map of the valley on the wall above the fireplace with more pencil lines on it now, more known and named, more fully their own. They did not always talk. Sometimes they just inhabited the quiet together, which was its own kind of conversation, the long and comfortable language of two people who knew each other's company as well as their own. On one such evening, with the fire settled low and comfortable and Matilda reading and Ira looking at the map with one of the ongoing productive stares that meant he was working something out, she looked up and found him looking at her instead. "What?" she said. "Nothing. Then, I was thinking about October 1884. She set the book down. "What about it?" "I was thinking about opening the door." He smiled slowly. "I didn't know what I was doing. I just looked at you standing there with that legal notice and that terrible mule, and I thought, this person has come a long way and is trying very hard, and the least I can do is make coffee." Matilda laughed. "That's a very practical origin story. Everything good I've ever done started with something practical." He reached across and took her hand. "You, specifically, started with coffee." "I started with a borrowed wagon and a legal notice," she said. "The coffee was your contribution." "Best pot I ever made," he said. She looked at him in the firelight, this man who had opened a door when he had no reason to and built a life from that single act of ordinary human decency, this man who was her home in the most essential way, and felt the enormous, simple, abiding truth of what they were to each other. "Ira," she said. "Yes, I love you." "I know," he said. "I love you too." He said it the same way he always had, directly and without decoration, as if love were a fact of the landscape rather than an event, which was precisely what it had become. She picked her book back up. He looked at the map for a while longer, then got up and added another log to the fire, and came back and sat beside her instead of across from her, and she leaned against him and read, and the fire settled comfortably, and outside the Colorado night was clear and cold and enormous and full of stars. The wagon sat in the barn now, properly theirs, painted and repaired, no longer borrowed from anyone. The legal notice was in Matilda's tin box with her mother's brooch and her father's letter, and 9 years of Ira's notes, and the children's first drawings. The map on the wall had the eastern parcel clearly marked with both the Alden boundaries and a small notation in Matilda's handwriting in the corner. Maddox, 1863, honored and resolved. Thomas Gerald Alden would one day stand on the rise above that parcel and show his own children where the creek ran and why the grass held there longest, and he would tell them the story of a woman who had come 40 miles on a borrowed wagon with a legal notice, and a man who had read it and asked her to come inside, and how everything that stood around them had grown from that moment. But that was future, and the future could wait. Tonight there was only the fire and the lamp and the books and the map and the warm particular quiet of a house that had been earned and was wholly known, and two people who had found each other through the improbable machinery of old claims and honest intentions and a door held open, and who had built from all of that something that was, by any measure that mattered, entirely and completely and permanently good.